Hey, everybody, we're back at the Bard Room, where we talk Shakespeare slash classical theater, and everything in between and beyond. Last time I was interviewing somebody was Lisa Cody Rappaport, um, who was a UConn crony of mine as well. And we, some of us remember, some of us have to memories back in gear, even if we don't want to at times. But I think we had a pretty prosperous career, and then that's a segue over to Will Kenyon that is joining us from Pennsylvania.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, what town?
State College.
State College. Okay, so for obviously near Penn State. And Will was a colleague of ours in the tech department. And I think mostly in lighting, or did you have to do everything?
Primarily lighting and sound. I mean,
Right, lighting and sound.
Trained in everything, but those are the two areas I designed in.
Okay, with the gyms, right? Fulton and I forgot the other gym's last name. Yeah, obviously, and I think you were undergrad with us, and then the grad students were there obviously as well. They combined the undergrad and the grad students pretty much together, although the MFA students obviously had projects to do, and I think we had senior projects, but they had projects all the time going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're still there for the MFA group, and we talked to Rick Walter from there and stuff like that. So these are names that I'm bringing up. I felt that UConn was a very classically curriculum for especially for actors, and the tech people are like, okay, we'll light it, okay, we'll rig it, what do you want, so obviously the professors, most of them would be directing the shows, and then you guys would have production meetings and just follow. Hopefully everybody has an idea that goes in there. But I remember the curriculum was movement in Shakespeare, dialogue in Shakespeare, acting in Shakespeare, voice and diction in Shakespeare. And then it's interesting, we'll get into this, but obviously we also do Boys from Syracuse or Jesus Christ Superstar or something like that, where people that's not quite that, but we did put up Restoration comedy, we put up Greek, and all of the above. And so I, in high school, couldn't stand it, but I had other things on my mind, meaning the classical theater stuff, the Chaucer and all that stuff. We did Brit-Lit. And then when I got there, I just got indoctrinated into it, and I can't seem to stop. But it's 30 years for me, and I think for you too, it's learning and learning and learning and learning, and then maybe doing the same show. I've done Midsummer 6 times and blah 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 with different ages and stuff like that. So you just every single time that it's like, oh, that's what that meant. Oh, that's what that meant. Okay, I should have known that 30 years ago or whatever. But I want to connect with people that in the Bard Room that have experience in all lines of work for theater, for live theater, even film, and things like that. So let's get to your UConn experience all the way up to now, and you have a vast resume, so keep it kind of short, but hit the highlights.
Okay,
so go ahead.
Sure. So I started at UConn in '87, graduated in '91, and as you mentioned, the BFA and MFA students were really allowed to work together pretty heartily, which I always felt was a real bonus of the program there. So I ended up designing a number of main stage shows in both lighting and sound through the time there, and that catapulted me right into graduate school. I went up to Brandeis in Boston and did the 3-year MFA there. The program there is essentially sonography, so you train in everything and take classes across the board. And it's a really interesting start because the first year, the playwrights, that performers, and the design tech people are all together in a very strong, cohesive unit. And then you start to differentiate as you go from there. Um, at grad school, I met my wife Jenny, who was there as primarily as a costume designer, and she was a year behind me, so I waited a year for her to graduate, and then the two of us moved to New York City and kicked off our freelance careers there. So we had been doing, all sorts of classic and some new works at Brandeis, because there was a playwriting program, so there were some new works, but we also had classic Shakespeare and a lot of the American classics. And then all of a sudden, moved to New York City, and we're jumping on all sorts of new things. And so I spent 5 years touring with a Native American dance company, the American Indian Dance Theater. And she worked for Radio City Music Hall and for the Rockettes. And after about 5 years, we decided it was maybe time for me to come off the road and for us to think about starting a family. So we moved to Nebraska, where we got both of us got a teaching appointment for 5 years out there, and taught in the program at the University of Nebraska Lincoln, which is the flagship theater program for that system. And then in 2004, came east to Penn State, and I've been here ever since. And I'm in charge of the lighting design program here, and also continue to function as a freelance designer, doing some dance, some opera, and some classic plays and musicals here and there.
Okay, cool. Let's go into your history a bit.
Sure.
So for the people that are just starting out, especially in tech, everybody from UConn went to New York. Everybody.
Yeah.
It was the closest place, obviously. And they all my friends roomed with each other, stuff like that. And they were, they knew what was going to happen, living hand to mouth, ramen noodles, all that stuff.
Oh yeah.
Was that your experience? And does it differ with tech? I tell my students a lot that tech is basically a little easier to get the gig than the acting gigs. Is that true for you? Or
yeah, I mean, we when we were in Boston, I went to grad school partly right out of undergrad because I wanted to get the MFA. I knew I wanted to teach eventually, and I knew if I moved to New York with everybody else in my senior class, that I would be working a ton and I would not get the opportunity to go back to school easily. Because before I was even done undergrad, I was already drafting and assisting a lot of professional designers around the East Coast. And so when we finally did make that move, I had a full plate of work up in Boston, but gave it all up and moved to the city so that my wife could get her career started. And there was the very first part of the year, we moved down there, spent all our money to get that apartment, put down the security deposit, first and last month's rent, all that good stuff. But then, we scraped together nickels and dimes and got on a ferry, and we lived on Staten Island, which was actually really scenic. Yeah. But got on the ferry one day, went and did some interviews in early September that got us jobs that led to other jobs that led to other jobs. And so by and large, design tech, there's a lot of work out there. And so pretty much we never stopped after we got rolling.
Right. So you're that after, especially with the degrees and especially after grad. A good idea.
I'm sorry.
Every part. Is that a good idea for every part of theater?
The MFA?
That track, anywhere you go?
It depends on what you want to get out of it. I mean, it's 3 years of really focused effort, and generally speaking, a lot of theater MFAs actually pay you. I took one that didn't. I had to pay a little bit, but I got a pretty good scholarship out of the deal based on my portfolio from undergrad. But a lot of people can, have a full assistantship and tuition paid for and a healthcare plan. So it's 3 years to set yourself up.
Okay.
And hopefully pay off any undergrad loans. And, so it definitely is a period of transition for a lot of people, where you're not quite fully relying on freelance income. I loved being freelance when I first got to New York. It was a lot of fun to be, just traveling all over the place and doing all kinds of different shows and being your own boss. And that was really neat, except for the financial stuff comes and goes. I mean, one month you might get paid for 3 gigs and the next month you don't get paid for anything because, you're in process for the next. So, so I thought that the process of being in grad school was really awesome. But I always tell students when they're thinking about it, what do you want to get out of the experience? Do you want to learn more about drawing, or do you want to learn more about script analysis, or do you just want to build some more experience at the tech table? What are the things you're looking for that helps you find the program that you might go to?
Right. And you probably counsel them on what their strengths are, and obviously find the program that would satisfy what they wanted. Give me a typical day at Penn State for you. Let's put it on a certain production that you're working on. So tell me, are you that day? Are you prepping? And give us a little bit what State has to offer as far as I'm sure you're working with the actors at that point. Has to offer with everything in that.
Sure. So I'm lucky that I have a colleague who also teaches lighting design. So during the normal day, the normal sort of 9 to 5, I have a lot of responsibilities as a senior faculty member to serve on committees and stuff like that. So my normally mornings and early afternoons are taken up with committee meetings, faculty senate, and teaching my classes and prepping for those classes. Almost all of my classes are taught in my light lab.
Okay.
I'm blessed to have a really fantastic light lab facility, which is basically a miniature theater that seats about 20 with a grid and everything. And so I can teach classes in there that duplicate, whatever we might be talking about in class. I've got a whole rig of old and new lights, LEDs, and incandescents, and so forth. So while I'm doing that, my colleague Ken is working with the students to prep the gear that might be going in to be hung for an upcoming show. Late afternoon, all of our shops are online. So most of our design tech classes are morning and early afternoon. And then late afternoon, all the undergrads work in the shops. And we do have MFAs in scenic and costume, but not in any other area. So there are some MFAs that are working in those 2 shops, but light, sound, technical direction, and stage management, it's all run by undergrads. And so afternoons are pretty busy with stuff getting prepped and built and so forth. And then we have production meetings Tuesdays and Thursdays for all of the shows that are in process. So if a show has started, its design process, or it's in the costing stages, or we've gotten into rehearsal, and then we have a weekly production meeting for it. So everybody will come together for those. Then hopefully we get a meal break, and then in the evenings we'll be in tech for shows. We have 3 theaters that we run full time. One is a 150-seat proscenium space that's kind of a project space. So shows go in there. They have 3 weeks and a moderate budget and a little bit of support. The other 2 spaces, one's a 200-seat flexible black box, usually set up as a 3/4 thrust, but sometimes full round. And then we have a 400-seat proscenium, which is a very large stage with 2 orchestra pit elevators and full flies and everything else. And so
space.
Yeah, it is. It's sometimes it's a little hard to fill it up with scenery. And we'll go back and forth between those 2 spaces. So there's always something in tech in one and something getting ready to be built or striking in the other.
Okay, cool. What was a memorable Shakespeare production that you worked on at Penn State or anywhere else?
Sure.
Let's try Penn State if you can.
Yeah, sure. Actually, so very recently, we did a production of Midsummer Night's Dream, which I believe was also my 6th production of Midsummer's.
There you go. Okay.
So I've had the good
fortune. Getting old.
Yeah. Done that one a number of times in a number of different situations. But during the pandemic, we took our black box space, which is called the Pavilion, offline, and did a whole bunch of upgrades. It's one of the oldest buildings on campus, and it was originally a cattle judging facility, harkening back to our agricultural roots here. But it's been a theater since the 80s. And it was designed by Kelly Yaton, who was a pretty big mover and shaker in the round space type theater design.
Oh, wow.
And actually, there's some links between Kelly and the people that made the Mobius at UCONN, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I haven't gotten drilled down on that too much yet, but I know that there's the two theaters sort of sprung up at roughly the same time, and there was some conversation about experimental theater.
How would you describe the Mobius?
A giant, fun jungle gym for everybody.
Yeah, okay. Just so that our watchers and what we're talking about. Different levels. You can put anybody in the round. You can do it, but there were so many levels to it. Jerry Rojo came up with that. So I'm assuming he worked with this in Penn.
Oh, actually, Kelly had passed away before I got here.
Okay.
But I do remember Jerry from my time at UConn.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you're doing Midsummer.
So we had this space as a theater for a while, but it was kind of the dumping ground for the old lights, and it was an old building, and it needed a lot of things done to it. So during COVID, we took it offline for half the year. And did a massive upgrade to the space, almost $850,000 worth of work. New carpeting in a lot of places, a whole new electrical infrastructure, replaced all of the lighting with LED fixtures, new sound stuff, did some repairs to the grid and so forth. And
are the theater students and faculty fully remote at this point, or at all remote?
Actually, we never went fully remote.
Okay.
I actually, interestingly enough, so my light lab that I mentioned earlier seats about 20, but during the COVID 2 years ago, when we were really separating everybody out, that meant that the room could only hold 8 at any given time. And so, and because we weren't doing full shows, we were doing some outdoor productions. We were doing some stuff in non-traditional spaces. We took the Pavilion offline as a performance space and turned that into my light lab because it sat 200. So that meant that with COVID rules, I could get 30 in there, no problem. And so we actually put a drape halfway down the middle of the space and hung 2 identical light plots with identical control systems. So 2 different students could be working in the space separated from each other, and we could do demos and stuff like that. And then I shared that with a tap class that came in the morning. But basically it was our my pseudo lab for the year. And then once that school year was done, we took it offline to do all this other work. So we were continually balancing, shifting our focus into different spaces with continuing to do shows. They might have had an audience of 10, or they might have been live streamed, or they might have been outdoors or things like that, but we never stopped producing. We were fortunate to be able to have the infrastructure and the faculty support and the student support to be able to do that, but it also kept the students going.
Right.
Yeah, okay. It didn't afford as many opportunities for the performers because a lot of the shows were either solos or two-handers or that sort of thing. That we weren't doing huge casts of big musicals or anything like that, unless we were doing the outdoor things, in which case you get a little bit more.
Right. So we'll get back to the pandemic and all my questions about that. Let's go stick back over to Midsummer.
Yeah. So we took advantage of that time down to invest in the infrastructure. And one of the things that we had wanted to do for a long time was build a full LED space because of the just the incredible influx of LED fixtures across the industry and lighting. I have 2 very small sort of performance rooms that have all LED in them, but it's mainly just for people to do monologues and stuff like that, but be able to have a little bit of lighting, a little bit of sound. But this was the first conversion to a full theater, and the first show that went in there was Midsummer Night's Dream. And so as usual, I generally have all my students do the work, but I did unfortunately have a situation where a student had to step away from their enrollment at the university due to outside factors. And that happened 2 weeks before the plot was due for this show. And so my boss came to me and is like, I really need you to just step in and take over and do this one, because it's too late to put anybody else in. And so I stepped in, and it was a little weird because I was stepping in a little later in the process. So I didn't enjoy the initial design discussions that that we set up for the students to enjoy. It was more like, okay, so what are we doing? What's the set look like? All right, we're going to go with this. I mean, I was kind of aware of what all that looked like because I was supervising my student, but it wasn't the same depth of immersion that I would have as a designer. Because it was just one of, a dozen shows that I was supervising at the time. So suddenly had to deep dive. At least it was a script that I knew very well. But like you say, there was every time you do one of these pieces, you're like, oh, okay, so that's how you could interpret that.
Right.
So this part of that part. So here we are trying to produce this Midsummer with this brand new lighting system. It's impossible to ignore the quality of LED lighting, which is different from incandescent. I mean, LEDs, incredibly robust color changing, but they don't have the deep warmth that incandescent does. But instead you have this amazing amount of color available to you, but it's a lot cooler colors, a lot of jewel tones that are available. And the costume designer had chosen to do tons of the costumes in a very black and white scheme. So there were just, all sorts of different black and white elements throughout. So that made it a playground for lighting to be, on the costumes. And in this particular case, the director really was trying to just take a whole new take on the piece. And I'm sure you've been there a number of times as well, where, okay, we've done this before. What are we going to do this time to make it different? Right. And personally, I'm not so sure we always have to do that.
Right. I know.
There are things that are, that were interesting and fun and different about this production, but there were times too where it just felt like we were forcing the issue. That, to make it different. And so I jumped into the process, and then we got into tech and tech the show, but we were still having to jump around a little bit because of COVID, and we did have we were super careful. Everybody was super careful, but every once in a while, somebody has an exposure from some sort of outside source, and so we did lose everybody on the production team for at least a night or two, who had to isolate because they'd been exposed potentially, and then come back. So we didn't really lose anybody for the length of the show, but I even had to step out for a day or two because I had a potential exposure until I was certain it wasn't. And so we leaned heavily on our assistants and associate designers, and there was one day the director was on Zoom on a laptop sitting on the tech table, and that, I think, was a real interesting shift, obviously, how we do live theater, because normally the expectation is everybody's in the room, and we really had to sort of adjust for that.
So I'm going to ask you a few more questions about that Midsummer. First of all, were the actors, did they have to be masked on stage? So
we were able to enter into a very specific agreement, and this was something that the School of Theater and the School of Music worked with the college to broker this agreement all the way up to the president of the university.
Okay.
And the agreement was that students could unmask to speak or sing on stage. Like they literally would be masked until they walked on stage, took their
Yep.
mask off, put it in their pocket, walked out on stage, did their bit. As soon as they came back off stage, mask again.
Right.
In order to accommodate that, there was no vaccination requirement on campus, but we were allowed to require people to be vaccinated to be cast.
Okay.
So there was I won't get into the political
No,
aspect.
I went through that too.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
But because this was not a requirement, but an optional thing,
Right.
then we could require people to be vaccinated. And then we also ramped up testing, and we
Okay.
were testing almost daily.
Right.
The rapid testing center, and literally just come in the morning, test, and then go.
Right.
And so with the vaccination, the care of people trying to stay in their bubbles, and the masking coming on and off, that allowed the students to all be unmasked on stage.
How
And
about in the booths?
they stayed masked in the booths.
In booths.
Yep.
So chuckling to myself because I'm thinking, okay, customer, make sure that there's pockets
Yeah,
in the
right.
costumes themselves.
Yeah.
And if they're
yeah.
doing like a cape or something, we got to sew it in or something
Yep.
like that.
There was actually, there were some discussion about that, but like, what do I do with the mask?
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, and having it like, where would they tuck it?
Shove it down the bodice or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the insane stuff that you have to think about.
Because you couldn't hand it to anybody, right? Because you couldn't touch
Right.
somebody else's mask. That would be bad.
Right. Like the lavaliers had to be,
Right.
handed back and forth, but which that would be terrible for COVID. So on segue from the costume question, what was this production design based on in as far as time frame, as far as do the costumes reflect the time frame, do the sets reflect the time frame? Because the thing about, I remember Bob McDonald, God rest his soul, did it at UConn, and he went from actual Greek costumes for the first at court, and then into complete Shakespearean Elizabethan garb for the woods part. Although the in the Greek costumes when they came into the woods, but all the mechanicals in the Elizabethan garb, and then they went back to court and stuff like that. And we all thought, this is insane. We're taught to keep the production as stream all the way through. But I realized later that was brilliant. It wasn't quite brilliant, but it was true to how it was written. Sure. Because Shakespeare just went from the Greek to the Forest of Arden back to the Greek type of thing.
Yeah.
Like, duh, 25 years later, I'm going, that's why he did it, type of thing. So what was the production design for this one?
So actually, it really didn't have a set time or date or place.
Okay.
Because it was in the round, we at one end there was a very large wall structure that was like a whole bunch of rectangles that were all stuck together with doors built into it, and then there was a ramp down into the playing space, and then there was a very sort of modernistic sculpture that was a whole bunch of wooden chairs and ladders that were all built together to make trees. And so we had these two trees downstage, and then also kind of up there's some areas that we call bunkers, which can be acting areas that are above the seating a little bit. And so there were some more tree sculpture elements there, and also along the railings on the outside of the space. So it was not really intending to evoke any particular location. And that really, one of the choices I think was mainly to focus on the words and not worry about the place quite the same way. Certainly the doors functioned as the city in a lot of it.
Right.
And the ramp had a thing that flipped up and became the bower. But a lot of the other parts of the space were used very flexibly for city or country. And then as far as the costumes go, again, not really a specific time or place that was being evoked. There was a lot of modern suit jacket type things, but they were always broken up with other elements added or sewn in or cut up or adjusted. And so a lot of more modern elements, maybe from the 50s forward,
Okay.
but sort of cast together in a way that created its own world.
So it created its own world on both ends, on the magical world and the human
Yes.
existing world. Did you feel, now I'm going back to what you said about we always have to do something new with Shakespeare. Did you feel that was what was new, that they didn't stick to a certain time frame, or did you feel that the set was a new thing? I mean, or was there a full and total concept that was new, that incorporated all the tech theories?
It was definitely a very new look.
Okay.
And I know that there was a lot of discussion about sort of why things would be done. The director early on wanted to sort of get away from the typical fairies in the forest,
Okay.
sparkling fairies with wings and stuff like that,
Right.
and wanted to get away from the artifice of that as much as he could. But it's integral to the story. There has to be some of that. So when we did do things like the plant that they use to put the sleeping drops in people's eyes, so when Puck is putting Titania to sleep, that element lit up with LEDs and lit up purple.
Okay.
And so that when we did do some magic, it was really called out as, okay, this is a very specific moment element, rather than sort of elvish fairies running around the forest the whole time.
Right.
So whereas they were fantastical colors, based on the interaction of the lighting with their black and white costumes, it didn't necessarily evoke the same sort of fairy dust.
Right. So you went basically with the scientific experiment thing where there's constant and variables, and the constant was the black and white, and the easy set and the simple set, and then your touches of color with lighting were the variables going on. So yeah, and I've done that before too, and it works extremely well. And it doesn't sound like they were trying to hit the audience over the head with something, like a concept or something like that. How they put Julius Caesar maybe as Trump, in the future or something like that. Go political statement or something like that. Blah blah blah. So that's cool. Let's go into what I do like to talk with tech people and actors at times and directors at times, but I do like to talk to tech people. There's a guy named Steve that was with us, a student at UCONN. I can't remember his last name, but he was so funny and so sarcastic about, we don't need actors. We can just do the tech without you people. You know what I'm saying? And so now the tech people and the actors had to take one class together, and that was theater history.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which was extremely, I do a lot of theater history. It really inspired me. But anyways, we both had to do that, and we would just go at it, before class starts or after class is over. And Steve would say, light show. We can just do a light show and you people don't have to be there. And so we would forth, and it was funny. We all liked each other in the end, that type of thing. And obviously we all need each other. We all work together. Philosophy, has it changed, or has it ever been that way with you guys as far as working together, especially in the production? You want me to light that? You want me to build that? want that, you know what I'm saying? And I don't want you to detail about, you know, one another person, but generally speaking, do they get heated? Do they draw back, or can you move forward, or is philosophy behind it?
Yeah, so let's say that your questions bring to mind a few thoughts. When I was at UConn, as is common with most programs, you know, all the tech people have taken acting class.
Right.
But
Right.
my first semester fall class, that year we started on a Tuesday, and the very first class I went to in my college career was the first day of acting class.
Oh.
And I'll never forget that, because I'm one of the, you know, there's a lot of people that got into tech because they didn't get cast and still wanted to be involved in the show.
Right.
I was never one of those that wanted to be on stage at all.
Right.
And so that was I still have such a visceral memory of that first day, and it was taught by Jerry Crasser.
Okay.
For those of you that don't know, Jerry was a very intense, passionate individual. So it was fun, and it was a class for the design tech folks. And so one of the things, you know, that I really got out of that was how much you are investing in being that other person. And so later on, when we move into being designers and we're like, well, why did the actor break that prop, or why can't they remember how to open that door? You know, one of the technical directors that was teaching us construction said, don't forget, and this isn't an insult, they're working with only half a brain as far as like walking around and stuff like that, because the other half of their brain is fully devoted to being this other thing, being this other character. And so it's your job as a technician, as a designer, to come up with solutions that make it easy for them to exist in the space in a way that flows for their character, and to just like make that an accessible, comfortable space for them to be in this other place.
Right.
And so I was always thought that was really very interesting. And so from the standpoint of being set design, technical director, that sort of thing, from the standpoint of being a lighting designer, I'm very separated physically in the space. And so it's really all about, you know, just making sure people are hitting their blocking. My wife, on the other hand, as I mentioned, is a costume designer. And so that design relationship with the performers is a very different relationship, because you know, at a certain point, you're there on your knees pinning stuff onto somebody who's just down to their skivvies. You know, and so you're talking in depth about you know, the characterization that this person is trying to do, and you know, that's all tied up into body image and what that costume does for them. How does it help them be in that character? And you know, there's a lot of psychological discussion that the costume designer will get into with the performers, based on, you know, the approval of the director, obviously. But you know, by that point, the costumer and the director have a real clear idea of who these characters are, and that's where that costume design comes from. So yeah, it's a very very different experience for that crowd.
Yeah. And then the production meetings, I mean, you got to get down to the logistics. Like, if we have ball gowns, can we fit through this door?
Yes.
You know, that type of thing, the logistics there. You know, if I have these shoes, can I go down this ramp? You know, type of thing. And so the more elaborate everything gets, the more the production meetings get interesting and longer, you know, in order to get everything done. And of course, the production meeting should happen before anything, you know, starts blocking or anything like that. And obviously you can come back to it, you know, that type of thing. And your lighting, and my lighting guy over at the place was, can they find their light? Can they ever find their light? And as a director, I always see that, because that's a liaison between the tech and the actors. And we're like, just be blinded. Just go into, like, you can't see a damn thing, you know, if you have to, you know, to be, you know, if when in doubt, do one of those things and stuff like that. So those are things that they learn as they go through it, that type of thing.
It's interesting that you mentioned the logistics of production meetings. We're deep into production for Metamorphoses right now,
Okay.
and certainly dealing with large bodies of water on stage throws an entire additional wrench into that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're going Cirque du Soleil with that one, right?
Because we actually had to split the focus into 2 different days as opposed to a single day, because we're gonna. So we hung the whole show on Saturday, and then this week we will focus the half of the lights that are over the water, and then the set crew will install the pools, because instead of one big pool, it's actually several smaller pools, which is a little different than the show is typically presented, but necessary for the weight of the water.
Right.
And so once those then get installed, then we'll focus the rest of the show. But we're trying to like pre-focus everything that would require us to put a ladder where the water will be, because you don't want to be touching electrical lights with, standing in water. So, but that just the logistics of figuring that one thing out, added several extra meetings to the whole process.
Absolutely. Yeah. Does Penn State have a statement as far as, does it do so many classical pieces? Does it do so many musicals? Is it genre specific, or or is it new playwright specific, or yearly idea of that?
I wish I had a clear answer for you on that. Without taking my colleagues, the season selection, to task too much, because they do have an unenviable task. But we don't really have a rotation that we've adhered to in terms of subject matter. What drives us is we have a very strong musical theater performance undergraduate degree, and 2 master's degrees, one in musical theater direction and one in music direction for musical theater. And so to serve that crowd, we do a number of musicals every year, and some years that's driven by, okay, the grad directors are going to each need a show. What are they ready for? So our season is built around the needs of the different programs a lot of the time, and so we might go years without an Arthur Miller. Whereas it's interesting, because my previous teaching gig at University of Nebraska in Lincoln, we had a very clearly laid out, delineated, maybe too much, I don't know. I think you can make the argument either way, but we knew from year to year to year, okay, in year 1, we're going to do a large Shakespeare, and we're going to do 2 small musicals, and we're going to do an American classic, and we're going to do a dance piece. And then in year 2, we're going to do something from a non-Western playwright, and we're going to do, X, Y, and Z. So you could basically look through and like, okay, we got to find things that fill these slots, as opposed to the way that we work now, which is, okay, what do we need to do to serve the different programs' needs? And so there's a lot of discussion about, okay, that's a great show because it's got a big cast, and that will serve a lot of the needs of the performers, but we've just backed that up against another show with a big cast, so now the costume shop is wrecked. And so there's a lot of back and forth to try and get those logistics all sorted out in a season.
And as far as, real quickly about the acting track, are you guys general, here's little Stanislavski, here's little Meisner, here's acting, or do you have one track for that?
The moment you asked that, the style went right out of my head.
Strasbourg,
no, there's a particular style that they follow.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't.
That's all right. Is it based on moving, so the Tedeschi? stuff or?
No,
Okay.
no.
Okay. That
But yeah,
doesn't, that obviously, well, it sounds like you guys are really, a large percentage goes to the musical theater
yeah,
track,
yeah.
which,
And we,
you know,
yeah,
Stanislavski, you may need him at times, but you
right,
know,
right.
this is
Yeah.
he's mostly presentational, you know,
Yeah.
type of theater. So that sounds like that's probably the focus. Although you may dabble in this or that, the other thing.
And we've
Um,
also had a big shift of retirements over the past 6 or 7 years, and a lot of newer, younger faculty that are now in that area. So I don't know that the focus has been quite so much on the more presentational.
Touching on that, I just came up with a query, which was when we went to UConn, I think 85% of our teachers had doctorates.
Mm-hmm.
You know, doctor this, doctor that.
Yep.
We
Yep.
always called them that. After 30 years, I really think, and you can attest to this or not, that it's changed. It just doctorates don't matter anymore. You may have one, and you will everybody is adjunct. It's a gig. This theater guy may come in and do a midsummer. I'll never see him again. That's what you guys do, or do you have a massive doctorate faculty that sticks with you?
There's definitely been a sea change in the academy, and certainly I see that here. We have a few doctorates, but they mainly are the folks in the theater history lit crit
Right.
zone. There aren't any doctorates in the design tech management area,
Okay.
and I don't know if we have any doctorates in performance. So what we're seeing though now is that a lot of my colleagues in design tech are tenured or tenure track, but very recently there's been a big surge of professors of practice, clinical teaching professor, that those sort of non-tenure track in titles. And so they might have a multi-year contract, but they're not in the same sort of vein of having to do classes and research and creative activity. They're there to teach the classes and support the production areas.
Well, when it first happened, it was about money. I don't know if
I'm sure it's still a good bit about that too.
Yeah. It's like how many doctorates can we pay?
Right.
That type of thing. And of course, but I'm assuming Penn State really does care about the arts in their place. Okay, so we just have a little bit of time left, and I appreciate all that information, especially the midsummer experience that you had. Oh, real quick, any other 2 or 3 other classes that you guys have done, let's say in the last 5 years, that have been new?
So actually, since we're talking about Shakespeare, we also did a production of Julius Caesar a few years back, but that was a place-specific production. And so we did it on the steps of Old Main, which is our big administrative building, which has Greek columns and stone steps and a door and stuff like that. And so it was just 3 nights only, and it was, I believe it was broadcast around as well. And so that was a very site-specific thing, but it's one of those places that just lends itself to the space. I mean, we threw some lighting up on the surfaces of the walls and on the columns, and then had some rigs out front of house to provide front light for the whole area. And that was it. I mean, there was not really any other scenery brought in of any sort.
Right.
And so in those situations, we are sort of hearkening back to the way that Shakespeare was writing before, for the globe situation, where there was always a set of columns and stuff like that. There wasn't it wasn't a huge artifice of tons and tons of scenery, and it really is more about the spoken word there. And so I thought that was a pretty successful production.
Did you go togas?
No, it was more sort of non-country specific, but very militaristic uniformish
Yep.
suits that evoked military uniform.
Right. Right. Because in the 80s they did a controversial version of that in the Nazi style.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so we can all go, it's been done. We don't have to,
Right. Don't go there again.
we don't have to go there again, that type of thing. Okay. So that sounds exciting. And so let's talk a bit about COVID. Tell me if there were if there was any shutdowns and the attitude philosophy of your colleagues towards it, because they may have that they may be doing in the summer or something in New York City where they completely shut down, type of thing. Was there an attitude? Was there, I mean, I was talking to you before we started recording, and I said, when I did Keep the Ghost Light On as a series for the Sherman Playhouse with the President Steve, a lot of people, we thought were going to be depressed and crying over this whole thing. And they were just like, it's another hurdle, type of thing. In fact, we had one guy say, you know what, this was when it first started. He goes, there's going to be a vaccine. There's going to be a booster. It's going to be fine. Just wait. Type of thing. So, and I wasn't thinking that because my wallet was getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner.
Right.
Okay, because that's, I got to do this. I went to school for this, So so that was, it was a big, and I wore my sleeve a little bit, and then when I doing this stuff, I really learned that people were just like, oh cool, I'm on a Zoom thing and I get to talk about my craft or whatever. It could be 5 minutes, but at least I got that, type of thing. So let me, why don't you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So, that first time, if that first moment when everything started shutting down was kind of a gut punch. We were actually on spring break, middle of March.
That's right. Yeah.
I was actually in my office drafting the section for a production of Carmen we were going to do with the School of Music in our big road hall, which is a 2,600 seat touring hall. And my wife was downstairs doing costume fittings for the same show. And all of a sudden an announcement went across the board, everybody get the heck out. And then over the next 48 hours, we were told, okay, yeah, we're going online. The students will stay away from campus for 2 weeks, and then we'll see. And we all were like, yeah, we're not coming back. So
right.
I immediately, before we were locked permanently out of the buildings, because they were going to take away our swipe access and we weren't going to be allowed in the buildings or anything. So I immediately grabbed my textbooks for my spring classes and for my fall classes, just sort of predicting, I don't know how long this is going to be in play, and some odds and ends like my cameras and things I didn't want to be away from. And I went over to my light lab and I got my light board and a couple of fixtures and some accessories and some cables and stuff like that. And I came home and I set up Garage Lab 1.0. And then I proceeded to, we all shifted to doing this online. Right. And so I turned my garage into a miniature light lab. And then had the students working with me on that. And the other shame of it was we were about to produce Spamalot as our last big main stage show in the Playhouse. And so, we couldn't do that show. All the students that were assigned to it, I had a student who was graduating that was going to be her senior capstone project, and she couldn't do it. But much like her specifically, but also just our group in general, we're like, okay, so this is just another logistical thing to figure out. This is what we do.
Right.
So
right.
In her case, in order to reap some benefit from the work that she had done all up until that point, I actually got her special access to a computer so that she could run some pre-visualization software, and she learned how to previs, which for those out there that might not be familiar, we can create lighting in a virtual environment based on the real plot and the real set, and then those cues can be exported to the light board. So she learned this very interesting and useful bit of software, and then wrote some of the numbers that she was going to light live. And yes, it wasn't nearly what the experience would have been if she'd been there, but it was just, okay, taking a left turn, what can we continue to do to build skills? And a lot of my students got really into the previs work, and some of them also started developing some other software projects. And that last 2 months of that semester was really rough and seat of our pants, and there was a lot of emotion up and down. But we already were starting to look ahead, and we're like, okay, yeah, we're not doing a summer season, that's out. What are we going to do in the fall? Like, we had a whole season already planned for the year, and so we're like, no, we're not going to be able to do those shows. What are we going to do instead? And so it immediately was, all right, we're not looking back, we're looking forward. What can we do to keep the students engaged? And so we came into that fall, and there was a big event that was around the world called Red Light Restart, which was which you may have heard of. And the goal was to light up the exterior of the theater in red, to support all of the out of work theater performers, designers, technicians. And so we actually lit up. We have a water tower that has theater lighting built into it. So we lit that up red. We lit up the front of the playhouse. We lit up the outside of the pavilion, and we lit up the recital hall next to us. And so that happened in early September. So it was like the first event for a lot of the new students coming in. We were really, really blessed that all the students that had committed before COVID to come as first years decided to still come. We didn't lose anybody from our area. And so it was great because they came in the door, and a week later we're doing a load out and load in, and we're lighting these buildings and everything else. And then that kicked off kind of the whole year of all of these experimental spaces where we're, okay, this is not what we would have done. It's not the same experience as doing a pit musical with 50 people in the orchestra and singing and dancing, but instead we're building theaters in non-traditional spaces. We're dealing with the challenges of the electrical, with the challenges of weather and security for gear outdoors, and we're dealing with the challenges of rigging stuff and all of that, all around some very specific rules about how long we could be in those spaces. One of the challenges was just your occupancy of the space was limited. So we could only be in a theater for 90 minutes before we had to leave for a half an hour to allow the air to recirculate. And so just the flow of a hang call was completely different, because normally we'd be in there for 4 hours with a 10-minute coffee break, and now it was very, very different flow. But again, all the students were like, cool, we're doing stuff. Like, that's what we're here for. We're doing stuff. And so it was,
in retrospect, this is going to be a hard question. In retrospect, is it worth it? I mean, you did a lot of new stuff.
Yeah.
Learn stuff. They got, and I'm just thinking about this now, they have obstacles thrown at them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then they may never, ever have done that in their careers, even in the future.
Right.
It's a hard question to answer it, but
yeah. No, it's funny because I actually teach an electrical safety class to the first years, and part of that class is all about troubleshooting. And we to explain troubleshooting, we use some case studies of some things that literally blew up on us. And I say about those isolated incidents, but it applies to this whole experience, that I wouldn't blow up a dimmer rack on purpose to force a student into a panic situation.
Right.
But when it did happen, when we lost a rack in the middle of the channel check before the first preview of a big show, in the middle of the 3 racks, the whole brain went dead. The challenges of working through that troubleshooting, and the students working with myself and my electrician, Ken, having them be involved in the processes of doing that troubleshooting, I think was a fantastic learning experience, and it's become a case study for so many others. So cool. I wouldn't do it on purpose, but I'm glad that it happened and that we were able to work through it.
Right.
Because it is, as you say, that that's a unique set of experiences that we just don't duplicate on a regular basis.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. A lot of my colleagues did outside stuff and had to figure that, out on the patios of places
Yeah.
and stuff like that. What I had to do, well, I didn't have to do it, but what I ended up doing a lot of my, whatever I wrote at the time, because I did a lot of writing, there wasn't much else to do, but so I would have my private students on Zoom and stuff like that. But I wrote a play that for a two-hander, and they did that on Zoom. And it's what you did. But as far as the actors are concerned, which is that's different than the tech people, is they don't want to do that again. They don't want to Zoom a show ever again.
Yeah.
Unless it has more a film,
Right.
intensity to it, that type of feeling. Obviously, film is a little bit different, but even then, they were, masked and everything like that, and getting tested and all that stuff, which I also heard about. But it's interesting because the performers are like, okay, can we get back to what we were doing, that type of thing. But again, they learned. The big thing that they learned was how to do reels were coming into existence 10 years prior to this, because you sent out your if you were a stage actor. They learned a lot more of that, and apparently the cattle calls for actors are listening, and what we're doing right now and interviews and their is becoming more. So they got to learn it. That's had to do with Zoom itself. That had to do with the that they could create in order for us to do this.
Yep.
So they did have to learn that.
Yeah. Yeah, we're even before COVID, we used to still have students build a hard portfolio and practice in-person interviewing in our business class, as well as to having a digital presence and a website and all that stuff. And then since COVID, we're like, no, forget it. We're going to talk about interviewing on Zoom, a digital portfolio instead of a hard portfolio, along with your website. That really kicked us. I mean, I knew we were going to be there eventually, but this really kicked us forward pretty quickly.
Right. Which is also interesting because a lot of my students, like for the neighborhood playhouse, if that or these places in New York, there's a lot of them that just interview you and they say, "Oh, do you have a monologue?" And you're just in an office, you're in this little office and you do a monologue right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas at UCONN, we were, we had to make sure we, all for the ERDAs. But you go to the ERDAs, and I was at Rutgers at that time, and huge space, and you had to fill it. So I think that's interesting about the small, and it's also tech too. The smallness is now, whether you have to do both basically, because you still have that huge fill as well. Well, it was great talking to you. I really appreciate it. When I stop recording, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Hopefully this came out, and I do apologize. There was this interruptions, but that's that. So thanks everyone for watching Will Kenyon and I on the Bard Room, and we'll see you next time.